thank all of you for coming down to this amazing event. So glad so many people are showing up here. I'm just going to introduce this little situation with this cool person, Clyde. When they moved in, he asked me if I had heard of Fred Funston, and I'm like, sounds like I should know that name, but I've never heard of him. And so that was my introduction to Fred Funston. And like I said yesterday, I just finished the third book 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. And when Clyde started telling me about this guy, I'm like, how have we not heard about this person? Shouldn't have we all been taught about him in school? And Clyde goes, well, I did, but I had never heard of him in school. And these books are so fascinating. The work that Clyde and Nancy and probably family have put into these books is unbelievable. The hours upon hours upon hours and years upon years of research. I was just so fascinated by all the effort they went into, Clyde and Nancy and family, and writing these 3 books. And so just so glad y'all are here, and Clyde and his son will take this away, and this will be so fun for all of us to learn about Fred Funston.
Well, welcome to you all. It's delightful to have such a great turnout. Thank you all for coming. This is your first Fred Talk, I know, because it's my first Fred Talk. And the reason why I say that is I came up with that idea only recently. Always before, I've just been advertising I'm doing Fred Funston, but today it's a Fred Talk. Now, my great thanks to Lisa. Where are you, Lisa?
I think you're talking about me.
Oh, there you are. But Lisa put all this together, which I really appreciate. She did the marvelous flyers, so I appreciated the quality of the flyer. It makes it look like a reputable program.
Happy to help.
And then I would like to make a couple of introductions. My assistant here is Nancy's and my older son. This is David. Some of you have met David. David is the Lieutenant Governor of Kansas and is also the Kansas Secretary of Commerce, so he's a busy boy.
Today I'm just the microphone assistant.
Doing good. Thank you. And then over here to my right, we have Thea Rodemaker, who is my publisher. So she deserves a big round of applause. She founded Flint Hills Publishing 10 years ago and has taken off with it, and it's really great. And she's a wonderful person to work with. She was a lawyer before she discovered publishing. And now she's a really smart publisher when she's also a lawyer. And then over here we have Sandra Gore, who is with the Flint Hills Publishing staff, and she is doing the videotaping of this. So eventually, it's, according to Thea, it's going to be on YouTube. Now, I used to give lots of public talks. I figured out one time that over 35 years, I gave an average of 2 talks a year. But then 15 years ago, I had a stroke, and the stroke was a fluke because I got a blood clot in a clear artery. And as a result of the stroke, I was 65% paralyzed, but with a couple thousand hours of therapy, now I'm only partially paralyzed on the left, plus I have only one functioning hand. So I'm sorry, but I no longer have the speaking voice that I did once upon a time, and I don't have the physical presence that I used to have. And then I discovered in practicing this, it's hard for me to maintain eye contact. And speakers are supposed to keep eye contact with the audience. And so if I'm not doing a good job on that, my apologies. Now we get to the important thing. Who the heck was Fred Funston? People are always asking me what Chris got into, and he's one of the most extraordinary people that I ever heard of. I first learned about Fred Funston when I was 8 years old. His boyhood home out in the country north of Iola, where Nancy and I are from, 75 miles south of here. The boyhood home in 1956 opened as a state museum. And I went there with our Cub Scout group, and that's when I discovered this extraordinary man. Just couldn't believe what he was like. So today I'm going to try and give you a feel for the overall picture of his life. He did more in 51 years than most people do in 4 or 5 lifetimes. So it's going to be as brief as I can make it. And I figured the easy way to do it was to read excerpts from the first chapter of my Volume 1, American Hero, Kansas Heritage. So, quote, when the news of General Funston's death was flashed across the country, from the president to the humblest citizen, we were shocked and stunned and said, surely a great man has fallen among us, end quote. Thus spoke the minister officiating at Funston's funeral. President Woodrow Wilson wrote a personal letter of condolence to Funston's widow. The Miami Herald observed, quote, Frederick Funston was a national hero and the object of great national affection, end quote. As a Major General of the United States Army, Frederick Funston, aged 51, held the highest filled rank at the time of his unexpected death from heart disease in February of 1917. A household name himself, Funston was the commanding officer of men whose names would later become household words. Lieutenant Dwight D. Eisenhower, Lieutenant George Marshall, Lieutenant George Patton, Captain Douglas MacArthur, and Major General John J. Pershing. To Pershing, not Funston, would go the command of the American Expeditionary Force when the United States entered World War I 2 months after Funston's death. Prior to entering military service, Funston's civilian careers had been many and variegated. Farmer, country school teacher, university student at KU, journalist, ticket collector on the Santa Fe Railway, field botanist in the hellish heat of Death Valley, and later in the Arctic cold of Alaska and the British Northwest Territory, lecturer, magazine writer, and guerrilla soldier in Cuba, fighting against Spanish rule. In contrast, Frederick Funston's United States military career was to last 19 years, starting in 1898, when, as a colonel of the Fighting 20th Kansas Volunteer Infantry, he commanded his troops in the Philippines at the time of the 1899 Philippine Insurrection or Philippine-American War, or simply called Philippine War. His bravery and skill were rewarded by Medal of Honor at age 34, and because of his spectacular capture in 1901 of the rebel Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo, Funston was transferred by order of President William McKinley from the Volunteer Army to the regular Army and awarded the rank of Brigadier General. At age 32, he had been a civilian, and now at age 35, he had attained the exalted rank of Brigadier General in the United States Army. Thereafter, a career Army man, Funston again acquired national fame in 1906, this time as, quote, the man who saved San Francisco, end quote, because of his work during and in the aftermath of the great earthquake and fire that ravaged that city. Quote, his genius and manhood brought order out of confusion, confidence out of fear, and much comfort in our distress, end quote. In 1914, After successfully serving as the military governor of United States-occupied Veracruz, Mexico, Funston was promoted to Major General. Always modest, Funston thereafter resisted efforts by his friends to have him advance to a higher rank, which would result in his outranking all other Army officers. Funston's unexpected death occurred at the end of one of his most valuable services to his country, maintaining the peace along the nearly 2,000-mile border between the United States and Mexico during the political troubles between those two countries from 1915 to 1917. As the commander of the Southern Department, Funston commanded approximately 150,000 soldiers, including both federal troops and National Guardsmen from throughout the country who had been federalized and brought to the Mexican border for service. This force constituted the largest U.S. Army since the time of the Civil War, some 50 years earlier. As commander of an entire theater of operations, Funston pioneered in the future pattern of high-level military command. Throughout his career for Uncle Sam, Frederick Funston's daring actions inspired his troops. Quote, "We would go to hell behind him," end quote. The words of several of his soldiers from the battlefield in the Philippines capture why Funston was such an inspiration to his troops. Quote, "Our little colonel is a daisy. He is not afraid of anything. He was out here on his horse the other day, and the sharpshooters began firing at him. But instead of running away, he turned his horse and took his field glass and looked all around, trying to locate the shots, at the same time saying, 'Those fellows would not just as soon shoot a man as not,'" end quote. Another soldier, Funston's cousin, Bert Mitchell, wrote at the time, quote, "Was my first experience under fire, and when the bullets began to drop all around, my legs began to shake, and my natural inclination was to dodge. But when I saw Fred riding up and down behind the firing line, as if on dress parade, it seemed to give us all confidence, and we braced to the work wonderfully," end quote. A third soldier noted, quote, that in one of the regiment's fights, Colonel Funston was on foot and kept running up and down the line, patting us boys on the back and telling us to give the rebels hell, end quote. Sergeant C.L. Sampson summarized Funston's stature with his troops, quote, "Colonel Funston, or Scrapping Fred, as he is called, has proven himself to be the bravest officer in the line, and one that the boys will follow through fire or water. When the fire is the hottest, he moves about unflinchingly and waves Mauser bullets aside as flies. He has found a place in the hearts of all of his men, and if he leads, the regiment will drive the hosts into the sea," end quote. But Funston was never one to bask in praise. At the huge 1899 welcome home from the Philippine War, celebration held for the soldiers of the 20th Kansas at Convention Hall in Kansas City, Funston, quote, in a clear voice that carried well over the great hall and was easily heard in the farthest balconies, end quote, responded to the adoring crowd of 7,500, quote, "I am not a hero." From the audience, there were cries of, "Who is then?" "I don't feel like one. Just an officer is all I am, who has been very fortunate because the officers and men under him have never failed to follow when he went somewhere. I know that it has been my lot to receive the major portion of the honor that belongs to the men. I give them 3/4 and claim only a share of the rest," end quote. Funston's death brought outpourings of grief from the American people. The first person to be so honored, He lay in state in the Alamo, Texas' sacred cradle of liberty, where in 3 hours his body was viewed by more than 10,000 people. Many of them had, quote, an eye in which sparkled a tear, end quote. The Alamo was dearly filled with flowers, and these reflected Funston's popularity, which extended to all classes. Quote, costly floral pieces were side by side with the simple tributes of humble workmen who, hats in hand and with bowed heads, filed into the building, end quote. Funston's body next lay in state in the rotunda of the new city hall of his beloved San Francisco. During Funston's funeral service at the Presbyterian Church, his pastor prayed for, quote, the bereaved family, for the American people who had lost a great leader, for President Wilson, deprived of an able lieutenant, and for the nation as a whole, facing a future full of uncertainties, end quote. Major General Funston was laid to rest in San Francisco in the cemetery at the Army's military fort, the Presidio, next to the body of his 7-year-old son, Arthur MacArthur Funston, namesake of Funston's commanding officer in the Philippines. The big guns of the Presidio boomed 13 times in final tribute. All street traffic ceased throughout San Francisco, and for 2 minutes, men stood with bared heads in honor of the beloved officer. Not bad for a Kansas farm boy who had never attended West Point. Today, a man who appeared destined to be long remembered is largely forgotten. Just as World War I swept away the monarchies of the principal defeated nations, it also swept Funston from public memory. Funston, the hero before the country's entry into the war, had been replaced by his subordinate and the war's eventual hero, General John J. Pershing. When Funston's name surfaces today, it is frequently as the subject of controversy, specifically for his role as a military officer in the United States conquest of the Philippines during the Philippine War and the subsequent guerrilla warfare, which did not officially end until July 4, 1902. Although an Army officer and not a political leader, Colonel and later Brigadier General Funston was never bashful about publicly condemning opponents of the war. He was articulate, and his language was colorful, all of which made good copy for the American people and press. These characteristics also made him a lightning rod for criticism by vocal opponents of the war. This role has continued posthumously with modern-day critics of this long-ago war, a war which resulted in U.S. acquisition of the Philippine Islands as part of an overseas empire. Funston's view of the anti-imperialists as the war's opponents were popularly were popularly known is easily understandable, since he believed that domestic criticism of the war effort encouraged the Filipinos to continue their fight against the United States. The result, in Funston's view, was the unnecessary deaths of American soldiers. In a famous 1902 speech to the Lotus Club of New York City, the little general averred as follows, quote, all of those men who have fallen since January 1900 have died not because the Filipinos really had much heart in fighting against us, but because they were kept up by a lot of misinformed and misguided people here in the United States. There was applause and cries of, "That's right." Funston went on to say, "It is perfectly proper for us to have all sorts of opinions about the advisability of holding the Philippine Islands. But for heaven's sake, let us keep those opinions to ourselves until the sovereignty of the United States has been established over every square inch of those islands. And then let us get together and pull hair and fight the thing out among ourselves," end quote. The crowd cheered Funston's words and applauded at length. This logical accusation of aiding the enemy by domestic criticism of the war effort probably has occurred in nearly every war fought by the United States. With his customary vigorous and graphic language, Funston proceeded in the same speech to infuriate the war's critics and his own when he proposed this treatment of them, quote, "There are a great many men in the United States who have done more harm with their mouths than those men did with the Krag-Jorgensen rifles that they carried to the enemy," referring to 2 American soldiers who had deserted to the enemy and who had afterward been captured and executed as traitors. "I would rather see any one of these men hanged for treason, charged for giving aid and comfort to the enemy, than see the humblest soldier in the United States Army lying dead on the field of battle," end quote. Strong language indeed, but reflective of an impassioned commander who valued his soldiers' lives above all else. Funston even incurred the wrath of author Mark Twain. He was also a leading anti-imperialist who vilified Funston because of his daring capture of Twain's hero, Aguinaldo, the leader of the Filipino resistance to United States rule of the Philippines. In his sarcastic diatribe, A Defense of General Funston, Twain excused Funston's conduct, quote, "because his conscience leaked out through one of his pores when he was little," end quote. Hiding in his remote jungle headquarters at Palanan, Aguinaldo had been surprised and captured by a small force of fewer than 100 men commanded by Funston. To accomplish this feat, Funston and 4 other American soldiers had pretended to be prisoners of war of Filipinos who were loyal to the United States and who in turn pretended to be reinforcements for Aguinaldo's army. Aguinaldo later admitted his surprise, quote, "We were all stunned by General Funston's temerity in appearing at Palanan in the way he did. I was never before in such a position, and it was certainly one of the most remarkable captures in history. I never thought I could be captured in such a way. General Funston is a remarkable man to have planned my capture in the way he did. I hope I may always number him among my friends," end quote. The captured Aguinaldo, president of the Philippine Republic and commander of its army, in the hours after his capture took 2 surprising actions. First, he wrote a complimentary letter about his capture to his captor, General Funston. And he insisted that his photograph be taken with Funston standing next to him. Aguinaldo acknowledged to one of his captors, quote, "I should never have believed that I could be deceived in this manner. I would not have dared to do such a thing," end quote. Quote, "The transaction was brilliant in conception and faultless in execution," end quote, wrote Funston's commanding officer, General Arthur MacArthur. Quote, "All credit must go to Funston, who under the supervision of General Wheaton organized and conducted the expedition from start to finish," end quote. Theodore Roosevelt, hero of the Spanish-American War and then serving as Vice President of the United States, wrote Funston an extraordinary congratulatory letter. In the initial sentence, Roosevelt averred, quote, "This is no perfunctory congratulatory letter, or formal letter of congratulation," end quote. He then complimented my dear general with these words, quote, "I take pride in his crowning exploit of a career filled with feats of cool courage, iron endurance, and gallant daring, because you have added your name to the honor roll of American worthies." Near the end of the 2+ page typed letter, the national military hero Teddy Roosevelt, who was 7 years Funston's senior, paid him the ultimate compliment. After speculating that, quote, "It is always possible that the United States may find ourselves pitted against a big military power where we shall need to develop fighting material at the very outset," end quote, Funston offered that, quote, "If that day is not too far distant, I shall hope to be serving under or alongside of you," end quote. The magnitude of Funston's accomplishment is apparent when one realizes that Aguinaldo's position was comparable to that of William McKinley, the then President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of its military forces. One can imagine the devastating political and military effect on the United States if the roles had been reversed and President McKinley, while at home in the White House, had been surprised and captured by the Filipinos. Of his capture, Aguinaldo volunteered that he, quote, "would not have dared to do such a thing," end quote. And yet Frederick Funston dared and succeeded. How did a 35-year-old man from the heart of the United States, the prairie state of Kansas, become the remarkable man and American hero that his archenemy so greatly admired? The answer is a coming-of-age story, since it was not until Frederick Funston was 32 years old that he knew fully who he was. His Kansas heritage is a significant part of Funston's story and is the subject of the first volume of my Becoming Frederick Funston Trilogy. So that gives you an overview of Frederick Funston's amazing life. And let's see how we're doing. Checking on the time here. I brought then there's 3 volumes, as you can see. There's American Hero, Heat and Ice, and then Yankee Hero. And the first volume is the Kansas-related one that gets us up to when he was 25. The next volume, Heat and Ice, is when he was in first Death Valley on a scientific expedition. He was on the first scientific expedition that the U.S. government ever sent to Death Valley. And then from there he was a botanist on that expedition. Then he went as a botanist to Alaska and to the British Northwest Territory. He was above the Arctic Circle. He traveled 3,500 miles down the Yukon and adjoining rivers. And that 3,500 miles, actually 2,500 was on the Yukon River, and the other 1,000 miles he did on snowshoes. And the weather was absolutely horrendous. There were times when the temperature got to 50 degrees below zero and he was sleeping outside. He was with Eskimos who went with him, and at night they would build a big fire, and the sled dogs, of course, once the men were sleeping, then would climb on top of the men for extra warmth. And Fred said that was okay until they started fighting. So you got these prostrate men with these dogs fighting on top of them. Not to be recommended. Now, as to what he did in order to combat the extreme cold, this is his description. He had this attire made for himself. up there in Alaska. Over 2 suits of knit underwear and a heavy flannel shirt, I wore corduroy trousers and vest, and over all this a complete suit of furs, consisting of a caribou skin coat or parkie with hood attachment, and mink skin trousers, and on my feet 3 pairs of woolen socks and 2 pairs of moose skin moccasins. My sleeping gear consisted of a robe of 24 lynx skins lined with a blanket. And there's actual pictures he had taken in Kansas City when he returned, because he went on a speaking tour. So I think he used those for publicity. Now, he traveled over the Chilkoot Pass, and several years later with the big Alaska gold rush, there were lots of men who made this trek over the Chilkoot Pass. Very difficult to get out, and then you had to go down the other side. But he, with some companions, actually pulled this off. And then they went over a series of 6 frozen lakes, and everything was frozen solid. And so they went down these 6 lakes. When they got to the 5th lake, that's when things started to pick up, because between the 5th and 6th lake, there was nothing but 55 miles of water, and included in that 55 miles of water was the notorious Miles Canyon, as well as the White Horse Rapids, both known to be killers of men. So I'll read you a little bit from his account when they're getting near to Miles Canyon. The next morning we were on our way by daylight, looking for the entrance to the dreaded Miles Canyon, which we knew must be near at hand. We had gone less than a mile when we saw ahead of us a great black cliff divided by what looked like only a narrow slit through which the river rushes, and at the same time heard the roar of the river in its wild rush through the canyon. With one impulse, we pulled frantically for the bank and got a line ashore and around a tree just in the nick of time. Landing, we found in camp 7 men with their boats. These men had crossed the pass a week before we did, and had built their boats at the foot of Lake Marsh, and were now engaged in portaging them around the canyon. The Funston and his companions, 2 fellows, they built their own boat, which they christened the Nancy Hanks, because they wanted it to be a speedy boat, and they were trying to think of things that were speedy like actresses. So they named it Nancy Hanks, which was the name of a famous trotting horse. It was quite a race horse at the time. And the boat was about 20 feet long, so it was not a long boat. The river, which has been about 300 feet wide, suddenly contracts to about 1/10 of that width, and increasing its velocity to 20 miles an hour, rushes with terrific force through a canyon with absolutely perpendicular walls 100 feet high. The canyon is only 3/4 of a mile long, and at its lower end, the river spreads out into a series of rapids, culminating 3 miles below in the White Horse Rapids. The volume of the river being enclosed in so narrow a space, the water rushes through with such velocity that it is forced up on the walls of the canyon, while down the middle is a long windrow of white sombers several feet high. There are 2 ways of passing this canyon, one by portaging over the hill on the east bank, and the other by boldly running through. Some of the men whom we found in camp there were utilizing the former method. The boats were unloaded and dragged out of the water, and by means of a windlass hauled up the hill slope 100 feet high, and then pulled on wooden rollers for 3/4 of a mile before being finally slid down another hill to the river. Sounds terrible. The contents of the boats were carried over by the men on their backs. It is the most slavish work imaginable and uses up the better part of 4 days. Of recent years, however, a number of men have succeeded in going through the canyon with their loaded boats. It is the most perilous and in some respects a foolhardy undertaking, but to men already worn out by hard work, it is a great temptation to avoid 4 or 5 days of pulling and hauling by taking a toboggan ride down a cataract and have it all over in 2 minutes. Fortunately, there are no bad rocks in the channel except one near the entrance, but the great danger lies in striking the canyon walls, as the boat would be crushed like an eggshell, or in being swamped by the huge white-capped waves or sombers. The canyon's sides come down to the water as steep as a wall, so that the loss of a boat means certain death to the occupants, as it would be utterly impossible for anything to escape alive from such a torrent. A Missouri man who was with the party camped here asserted with a lurid cuss word that it would drown a catfish, and no one disputed the Missouri man's word. In the last few years, several boats, 3 I believe, have been lost in the canyon. Others saw the men start in and heard their shrieks afterward, and the splinters of their boats were found floating in the river miles below the canyon, but not one of them was ever seen again. We 3 canvassed the situation pretty thoroughly. We watched men pulling and dragging their heavy boats up the steep hillside, sweating and swearing profusely as they toiled, and we climbed up to the top of the canyon walls and looked down on the seething torrent underneath, speculating on the chances of a boat living through it. We returned to the landing just as a big fellow, formerly a Wisconsin lumberman, announced in lurid language that he was going to take his boat through the canyon. All ran to the top of the canyon walls and crawled out as far as they dared to see the sight. Seated in the stern of his boat and using an ordinary canoe paddle, he steered into the entrance of the canyon, the men on the rocks above watching in breathless silence. As soon as the boat was caught by the swift water, it flew with the speed of an express train. The ex-lumberman plying his paddle vigorously to keep it on top of the windrow of white breakers and off from the canyon walls. As he passed underneath us, we waved our hats and yelled like maniacs. The boat was soon out of sight around the first bend, but in a couple of minutes, we heard a rifle shot, the prearranged signal that he had passed the canyon in safety. This success nerved up 2 young fellows from Colorado who tried it with their boat. Once they missed the canyon walls barely 2 feet, but in a moment we heard their rifle shot and knew they were safe. We had seen both ways of passing Miles Canyon, one taking 4 days and the other 2 minutes, and our minds were made up. We 3 looked at each other in an inquiring sort of way, and then without a word walked down to where the Nancy Hanks was moored against the bank. All took their places, kneeling and facing the bow, McConnell in the stern, Mattern amidships, and I in the bow, all facing forward and using short canoe paddles. I must confess that I never felt sicker in my life than as we shoved away from shore and steered for the entrance. It was all over so quickly that we hardly knew how it happened. Barely missing the big rock at the mouth of the canyon, the boat started on its wild ride. It was a great ride. The boat jumped up and down on the breakers like a bucking bronco, and the black walls seemed to fairly fly past us. Just after starting, we heard a lusty cheer from the cliff above, but we didn't dare to look up. By frantic paddling, we kept in the middle and off from the canyon walls. We were through in less time than it takes to tell it, and landing at the foot of the canyon, fired a shot to let the others know of our success. There was not a dry spot on one of us when we got through, and the boat had taken on so much water that she nearly foundered before we could bail her out. But a great weight was off her miles, for Miles Canyon, more than all other things, is dreaded by Yukon travelers, including those lost in 1894. An even dozen of men have had their boats swamped or crushed like eggshells against the canyon walls, and not one of them has come out alive of that wild maelstrom of water. Would you like to hear another exploit? Now we'll go to war. So we'll go to war in Cuba. And Funston went as a volunteer to help overthrow Spanish rule of Cuba. This is the years before the Spanish-American War of 1898. He was a journalist also, but as a journalist, he wound up being embedded in the army as a soldier. And it turned out that because of the Spanish barricade of communications, he was unable to get any of his communications back to the paper in New York City. So in the end, he was not a journalist at all, but he became a full-time cavalryman, and he was an infantryman, but his big thing, he was an artillerist. And if they didn't have artillery up at a particular time, then he would serve in one of the other roles. But it was a tough life for the Cubans. These are your native Cubans who are rebelling against Spain. So first, to help set the scene, in about 1906, Funston wrote a letter talking about the hardships that they had suffered. Hardships, great God. When I look back at some of the things that we Cuban insurgents went through in 1896 and 97. In those days, we were for weeks so famished that men often became delirious from hunger. Many a day, the sole ration consisted of a few sticks of sugar cane, which we chewed, swallowing the juice. And I recall how often I wakened from a troubled sleep, in which my dreams had been of bacon and kindred things. There was not even a tent for the commanding general, and we simply ignored weather. I was an officer, but only 5 nights in a year and a half did I sleep under cover. And I had no blanket, not even for my horse. For 5 months I had not a stitch of underwear. My outfit consisted of a hammock, poncho, revolver, machete, pair of field glasses, the clothes on my person, and not one other thing. So they had a really tough time. So one of the fascinating battles that Funston wrote about occurred at a place called Desmayo. And to try to explain it, there was a troop of Spanish infantrymen, about 2,000 total, and the Cubans, who had much fewer numbers of men, they were pursuing the Spanish troops. And in the night, the goal of the insurgents, meaning the Cubans, was to get around in front of the command of the Spanish column of troops, so that in the morning they could surprise them. They actually were ahead of them. So that's what's happened. They've gotten around in front. It's night. They're waiting for dawn to come. So then Funston says, it was now fairly daylight, but an impenetrable fog had settled down over the landscape, and one could not see 30 feet in any direction. As we sat on our horses awaiting developments, we fell to conversing in whispers, and I noted that the voices of all Americans and Cubans alike had a decided tremor. If a man's personal feelings at such a moment are of interest, I am free to confess I would have given a handsome sum to be elsewhere. It was the long wait, the doing nothing, that unstrung the nerves of all. We now began to hear noises in our front. sometimes the neigh of a horse or the bray of a mule, but more than anything else, the sort of undefinable sound made by more than 2,000 men splashing along the muddy road, with the accompanying jingle and rattle of their arms and equipment. The rumbling grew louder and nearer, and all of us were straining our eyes to pierce the fog, when suddenly the fog ceased, and all was as silent as ever. At this juncture, a breeze sprang up from the eastward behind us and began to roll back the fog. Our own line was soon uncovered. We got a good look at ourselves for the first time and saw a slightly curved double line about 300 yards long. Near our end of the line was the silk flag of General Gomez's escort. Gomez was the leader of the insurgents, carried by a big Negro sergeant. Slowly backward rolled the fog, gradually uncovering the ground on our front, while the sun, half an hour high, showed itself for the first time and lighted up the whole scene gloriously. The nerves of all were strung to the highest pitch, for we knew that the crisis was at hand. Finally, we made out on our front, not more than 400 yards distant, something that at first looked like a hedge or a picket fence. But in a few seconds more, as the fog cleared up, it was seen to be a force of infantry in the line of battle, forming two sides of a hollow square with two field pieces at the angle ready for action. The enemy had suspected that we were on their front and were prepared to receive us. Mingled exclamations of surprise and consternation ran up and down the line, with the general order a charge or a retreat. Opinions on this point were about evenly divided. There was an embarrassing wait of half a minute. General Gomez was taking in the situation before deciding what to do. The Spaniards, uncertain whether we were Cubans or Spanish guerrillas who had come out to meet them, hesitated to open fire. But the suspense was soon over. From where Gomez and his quarters and his staff were waiting came the quick, jerky rat-a-tat-tat-tat of the headquarters bugle sounding the charge. The effect was magical and instantaneous. The moments that followed were, it seems to me, worth some years of humdrum existence. It would be a mighty poor sort of a man whose heart would not thrill as his mind went back to that wild charge across the Cuban savannah. The whole line moved forward, first at a trot, and then at a gallop. The Cubans were firing over the heads of their horses as they advanced, with Winchester and Remington carbines, while above the terrific din rose the yells of "Viva! Viva Cuba! Adelante! Adelante! Arriba! Arriba!" We had covered scarcely 40 yards when a blaze of light broke along the whole front of the Spanish line, followed in a few seconds by another and then another, while at each discharge the air about us seemed full of the spiteful crackling of Mauser bullets. The scene that followed is beyond description. Men and horses were falling on every side, while above the crash of rifle volleys and the booming of cannon rose the frantic cheers of the Cubans and the thunder of nearly 2,000 hoofs. The Spaniards gave us 6 perfect volleys, emptying the magazines of their rifles. But the fire after that was at will and rather wild, usually too high. But it does not take long for horses to gallop 400 yards, and in a short time we were upon them. The Cubans showed no disposition to force their horses on the bayonets and come to close quarters with a machete, but rode furiously up and down the line at a distance of about 20 to 40 yards, emptying carbines and revolvers in the faces of the Spanish infantry, and did good execution. The Spaniards, who at the beginning of the charge had done such perfect volley firing, were now shooting wildly. All had their rifles at the hip instead of at the shoulder, and were madly pumping bullets into the air. And incredible as it may seem, even at that close range, the greater part of their fire was passing over our heads. We were so close to the Spanish line that we could distinguish the features of the men whenever there was a temporary rift in the smoke. It was plain that they were excited, but there was no sign of panic or of giving way. The 2 Spanish cannon that had peppered us badly with canister while crossing the open space were now withdrawn behind the line for fear of capture. We had held our hopeless position on the Spanish front for something more than a minute, and it seemed that, notwithstanding the bad firing of the enemy, we were to be cut to pieces, when suddenly a lively scattering fire opened on our right, and the woods 500 yards distant were being flecked with the white smoke of the Remingtons. We were certain that the new arrivals were friends. The Mauser rifle used by the Spanish regulars makes little or no smoke, and our surmise was correct. Avelina Rosa, the Colombian, had arrived with 300 infantry and was making a well-directed and most determined attack on that part of the Spanish half-square facing the north, which hitherto had not been in action. This fire, of course, caught on the flank the side with which the cavalry was engaged, and rendered the Spanish position untenable. The Spaniards facing the attacking infantry replied to their assailants with rapid volleys, but with little effect, owing to the fact that the Cubans were deployed in open order and were advancing stooping and crawling. The closely packed Spaniards standing upright lost more heavily, and their commander, doubtless thinking that the attacking force was a large one and that he was in danger of being surrounded, ordered a retreat, which was conducted without confusion. They carried from the dead all their wounded and the greater part of their dead. The rear guard, in the meantime, keeping up a fire on Rosa. Under ordinary circumstances, this would have been the opportunity of the Cuban cavalry to use the machete, but they had been so severely punished that they were glad enough to quit. There were scarcely 100 mounted men left, half of those not killed or wounded having lost their horses. Within 5 minutes after the bugle had sounded that fatal charge, the Battle of Desmayo was at an end. My horse was shot a few feet from the Spanish lines, and I busied myself with removing my saddle and bridle. Good saddles and bridles are too scarce in Cuba to lose. When I got my saddle and bridle, I walked away because I was no use there on foot. It was only in the way. But he doesn't tell you that when he says walked away, he did that by tying the saddle to one of his legs and the bridle to his other leg, and then he crawled on his stomach about a quarter of a mile to get away from the battle. The Spanish loss was 204 between killed and wounded. The little force of 479 Cubans lost 52% of their men between those killed and wounded. So this is all a part of Funston's formation to ultimately becoming the famous United States Army officer that he became. So that's the organized part of what I wanted to share with you. And I would like to say, before I turn it over to Theo, who's going to close, that I'm very appreciative of all the wonderful support I had on my writing my Becoming Frederick Funston Trilogy. Nancy, whom you all know, of course, was instrumental throughout. Our 3 children, David, Andrew, and Elizabeth, all helped in different ways. Thea's been wonderful, as I mentioned, as publisher. Lots of support over the years. I spent 27 years on this little project. And so it was a period of time. And one of the nicest things was I had 15 different people who wrote endorsements for my books total. And the first one, American Hero, my very first endorsement came from General David Petraeus. So that was, I wrote letters and he responded and said, we'll do a blurb. They call them blurb endorsements. And then Chancellor Girard of KU, he wrote an endorsement for the first volume, as did retired General Myers, who was then K-State President, Richard Myers. He wrote an endorsement. That's volume 1. Volume 2, Bill Curtis of Curtis Productions, who's a famous Kansan, has documentaries like American Greed, things like that. Wrote a very nice endorsement. And for volume 3, Senator Nancy Cassabaum Baker wrote a wonderful endorsement. So anyway, I'm very grateful to the 15 who took the time to read the book and then write a few words of support. So I'll turn it over to Thea, who will close us out.
Thank you, Clyde. You know, Clyde, I find it interesting that in your reading you said that Funston was never one to bask in praise. Well, I think you and Fred have something in common, because you were very modest about how hard you worked on this book and the accolades that you've received. So as his publisher, I want to brag a little bit on Mr. Toland here. This book, American Hero, won a Spur Award. That's a really big deal. This is an award given by the Western Writers Association of America. The category that Clyde won for American Hero was Best Western Nonfiction Book for 2023. This is described as a prestigious award in the field of American literature for writing about the American West. It's been presented annually since before I was born, 1953. There is fierce competition. There are a lot of submissions every year for a Spur Award. Winning a Spur Award signifies that the author's work has been recognized for exceptional quality and contribution to the American West. Clyde is in really good company as a Spur Award winner. You may have heard of other winners such as Larry McMurtry and Tony Hillerman. Now, he won another award too. One that I was very thrilled about because my grandpa loved Will Rogers. And this book, again, the first one, won the Will Rogers Medallion Award. It's a prestigious award for Western literature, and it recognizes excellence in works that reflect the spirit and values of the American West. Well, I would say that excellence in spirit and wonderful values also reflect you, Mr. Toland, and it has just been an honor to work with you. And if I'm going to get personal about it, you've made Flint Hills Publishing legit. It was after we started working together that many, many good things happened. And you are such an inspiration to me on how to live a good life, on how to continue to give to others, no matter where we are, at what point in our life. And it's just, I love you, Clyde. It's been terrific. So, okay, the books are for sale. They are $20 each, tax included. That's a deal. Or you can get 3 for $55. So they make wonderful gifts. So we are prepared to sell them to you today. So thank you for coming. Sandy's going to put a video of this on the YouTube channel. And there's also my most viewed YouTube channel is the interview we did, where you explained how you got all these wonderful blurbs. And all of my authors, that's mandatory viewing. I make them watch that. And it's very interesting if you want to hear some of the strategies that Clyde used on getting some incredible blurbs. So thank you for coming today. It means a lot to an author to be able to share their work. Thank you.